we can ask them. We can ask
Great.
them in the comments. They're all men. Most of them are from India, but we are officially live. Hi, everybody. People will be joining in shortly, but thank you all for joining in this live chat. And we are so excited and so honored to be here with you. Thank you so much for joining. We have the incredible Dr. Vikram Patel with us. To give you a little bit of context on Dr. Patel, he is an Indian psychiatrist, as you might read on the internet. He did most of his training in India itself, and I know a lot of you are interested in that. And he currently is a professor at the Harvard Medical School, has also taught at the London School of Tropical Medicine, and has worked across the world. Not only has he accomplished in his field as a doctor and a professor, but an incredible researcher, and he's the founder of an organization called Sangat, which is an incredible way that you kind of have a model of training people in mental health professionals across India. It's based out of Goa, but what I love about the organization that's won incredible awards, from the MacArthur to Dr. Patel being named Time 100 most influential people, is the fact that it is focused on how to make sure that we are being empathetic with our own community and empowering our own communities to make change. So without further ado, here is Dr. Patel, and I would like to know if you feel like I've missed out anything you'd like to say, anything about yourself.
Well, thank you, Avanti. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I also wanted to say, give credit to you. I think I had the wonderful pleasure and privilege of mentoring you when you were an undergrad at Harvard College, and also discovered what an amazing talent you had to combine not only your interests in the humanities with a passion for mental health, and of course, bringing in your talent for music and performance to it. So I wanted to also appreciate your incredible contribution.
Thank you. No, that really means a lot. And, when I told people that we are going to have this chat today, they were so excited, and I've received hundreds of questions that I've tried to compile into, small nuggets. But before we get into questions, just for everybody watching, we're just going to talk a little bit about mental health and the basics, and a little bit of Dr. Patel's expertise. Then we're going to go into some of the questions y'all had submitted, and I've combined them into mini questions, and then we'll open it up to the chat. So feel free to send in questions while we're chatting, and we'll try to get to those as much as we can. Just so you know, Dr. Patel, there are several people who are very excited here already. And some of you are asking questions that I actually decided to be the first question. So why don't we start with what is probably a very simple question to you, but what a lot of people are concerned about, which is, what exactly is mental health?
So that's a very big question to start with, but obviously a key one. I often ask that question to my students. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the words mental health? And I give them choices. The choices would look like a mental illness, something that's medical and needs doctors and drugs and medicines to treat. B, a state of well-being that is a positive state of happiness, of satisfaction, of fulfillment, of feeling that you have a purposeful life. C, suffering because you have difficulties in your life, and so on. And it's very interesting, if I had to ask this question 20 years ago, a large number of people would say, when we hear the word mental health, we think of a medical problem. We'd be really thinking of mental health from a very narrow prism of disease, sickness, doctors, drugs, etc. But today, I'm really delighted to see that most people actually say we see mental health as a valued asset, something that we cherish, something we want to nurture, something that is central to our everyday lives. And actually, that is precisely what the World Health Organization also defines mental health as. It's a positive state of well-being, for example, where one is able to enjoy one's life, one's relationships, be productive, and be meaningful in terms of our relationship with our communities.
I love that. And, for whether it's Sangat or some of the, tributary organizations you have, that's It's Okay Not to Talk, It's Okay to Talk, and Manmela, I love the videos you all have created explaining mental health. And for anybody watching, please check them out. I will link them in the description below, because as you're saying, it's talking about mental health being A, on a spectrum, and B, this idea that it is something that enables us to live productive, healthy, meaningful lives. And it's not just a disease, a medical condition, or something, you know.
That's right,
So
Avanti, because a disease concept means that mental health is only important to those with the disease. First of all, to be quite honest, there's no real way of knowing who has this disease and who doesn't. You're absolutely right, it's a spectrum, but this idea of mental health being so central to our lives means it's important to each and every one of us.
that is, no, that makes a lot of sense. And that's incredibly true. It's something that is a part of each of us. And so that, you know, brings me to my second question, which is, why do you think there's a stigma around mental health if it's something that's integral to our lives?
Well, I think the main reason, I mean, I have a very provocative answer to that. I think the main reason is because for far too long, we have equated mental health with madness, with the most extremely stigmatized form of mental health problems. And the word madness is a very important word that I use because that is exactly how society has treated people with severe mental health problems, that they're crazy. You know, in the past, we used to use words within the medical and policy language, words like lunatic and idiot, in a medical way. And that in itself tells you something about the origins of stigma, the very language that has been used to describe people who are suffering from a mental health problem was essentially one that was discriminatory and stigmatizing. And then consider what happened to the mad. They were usually carted off in a straitjacket, oftentimes by the police in a police van, like as if they had committed a criminal offense, taken to a judicial magistrate who would then lock them up into an asylum with no known date of release. It was actually probably better for you to commit a crime because at least you then have a specific date by which time you'd be released and regain your freedom. But if you had mental illness and were committed to an asylum, there was no knowing when you'd get out. When you were in the asylum, you would be treated as if you were a prisoner. You would have no freedoms. Oftentimes, you would find yourself packed into very crowded rooms. You'd lose all your dignity. Literally, you'd be stripped in many instances, and you'd face unimaginable kinds of violence. Now, if this is what would happen to you when you were considered to have a mental illness, and if mental illness and mental health were conflated, you could begin to see the origins of stigma.
Yeah. No, that explains a lot. And I don't think certain cultural nuances around it have helped, right? And the ways we describe things. We very casually, in parts of our society, throw around the word pagal, right? We throw around the word pagal so loosely. We throw around some of these words, and I think our vocabulary makes a huge difference. Speaking of vocabulary, somebody had a question which I would like to address now because I think it's important. What is the difference between a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and any other mental health professional? Could you help us distinguish among them?
Oh, of course, yeah. Well, you know, these are all different kinds of professional disciplines which address mental health problems, people who are suffering from a variety of impairments to their mental health. The basic difference between the two is this, that a psychiatrist is a medically qualified professional who has gone through medical training just in the same way that a cardiologist or an orthopedic surgeon has, and then has specialized in this clinical discipline of psychiatry. A psychologist, on the other hand, has specialized in the field of psychology as the first degree instead of medicine, and then gone on to do a specialization in the area of clinical psychology or educational psychology, and then become a practitioner in that particular realm of psychology. Psychologists tend to be far more likely to see mental illness from a psychological perspective and use psychological therapies, whereas psychiatrists are far more likely to see a mental illness through a brain perspective and to do with the biology of the brain, and therefore would tend to use more likely things like medicines, which, of course, being medical practitioners, they're licensed to do as well. Now, you asked me about other mental health professionals. Actually, there are many others, art therapists, drama therapists, and so on. They have their own different disciplinary backgrounds. I would say they fall into the range of alternative therapies that have been increasingly become popular for helping people with mental health problems. And in many ways, actually, Avanti, this question really brings us to the recognition that mental health care is a very diverse area of inquiry. There are many different professional groups. There are many, many disciplines that have historically tried to address mental health problems. And don't forget, there's also the whole range of traditional systems of medicine in India, for example. We have Ayurveda in China, you have the traditional Chinese systems. And more recently, you see the emergence of very old systems of health and well-being like yoga going global as well.
I mean, thank you so much for clarifying that difference. And thank you, Shreya, for asking that question. I think it's important to understand the distinction, right? So we don't club everything, but the fact that you're saying that there's so many opportunities in the space of mental health, right? Both in order to make an impact as well as in order to seek therapy or seek assistance, is incredible. And that, leads me to my next question. There are many people who ask a twofold. What is it like being a psychiatrist? And how do you know when you should go to one?
Okay, what's it like? Well, the first one, you know what? When I trained in Mumbai and medicine, but then I did all my psychiatric training in the UK at one of the world's leading residency programs at the Maudsley Hospital. And, for me, psychiatry then was one of the most exciting disciplines of all disciplines in medicine. Why? Because it was the only discipline in medicine in which at least there was a perceived interest in the person. So, typically on a clinical examination, I wouldn't ask the person why, what's hurting, or where are you, where's the pain. The first thing I'd ask is, what do you do? Who do you live with? What's your childhood been like? And so there was a sense of trying to understand the person's suffering in the context of their life story. And I found that very, very interesting. I felt that it was the one branch of medicine that tried to marry biology with the humanities. Unfortunately, that's not the way psychiatry has since morphed. It's tried to become more and more biological and therefore closer to medicine. And therefore, I've become a little, I have to say, disenchanted with psychiatry. I feel that its historic origins in terms of championing the individual, their personal worlds, their childhoods, their life experiences to understand their mental health has been somewhat pushed into the shadows. And what seems to have gotten dominant is this focus on biology, on cells, on circuits, and so on. And so my own work is striving to try and take psychiatry back in some ways to recognize the social origins of many of our mental health problems. And then the next question links to this is, when do you think you should go see a mental health professional? Well, there isn't any hard and fast rule, but this is what I generally tend to tell people. If you have difficulties with your mental health that are affecting many different aspects of your mental world, for example, your thinking, your feelings, and your behavior, if this is having a significant impact on your daily life, for example, it's affecting the way you can concentrate at work, or you can enjoy relationships that you value. And thirdly, if it's been going on for a long time, there's no real precise amount of time, but generally we say for more than 2 weeks, most of the time for more than 2 weeks. So these three things: how pervasive is it, how impacting it is, and how long it's been going on. You really have to make a judgment on the basis of these three criteria. And if it is the case that it's pervasive, impacting, and more than a couple of weeks, I think that's a pretty good signal. You need to seek help from someone. And I want to end by saying that someone doesn't necessarily have to be a mental health professional.
So then who can it be if it's not a professional?
Well, the first thing is to reach out to people in your immediate social networks that you know are going to have an interest and care for the way you are feeling. I remember being at this wonderful event some years ago where this young woman who had her own tryst with mental health problems. She said something which will always stay with me. She said, isn't it interesting? If you see a cut on your leg, that is bleeding, would you just sit around watching it and wait until it stops bleeding before you seek help? No, right? Okay, it's a rhetorical question, right? So the question, the reason she was saying this is that, why do we do that with our mental health? Why do we, for example, sometimes feel terrible about ourselves, feel that life isn't worth living, feel so angry that you want to cut yourself so that you can release the pain, etc., etc., etc.? Why do we sit and wait and do these things and experience these things rather than doing what we would have done with a cut leg? We would have gone and immediately spoken to someone and say, hey, you know what? I'm feeling so angry right now that I feel I could hurt myself. And I think that is what we need to be doing a lot more with our mental health, simply reaching out to someone else in our immediate social networks when we're experiencing something that is causing us enormous distress or pain. And by pain, I mean inner emotional pain.
Emotional pain. So a lot of people, and both in the comments and in questions, have asked, how do you talk to somebody, a friend or a family member, especially अगर आप छोटे हो, अपने माँ बाप को इससे बात करना चाहते हो, but वो सुन ही नहीं रहे हैं कि आप कह रहे हो, I'm dealing with something and they're not listening. What would you say is the best way to start talking about mental health to people who are close to you? Whether you are struggling with it or whether you think they might be going through something and you want them to seek help.
There are two different scenarios. The second one is much easier to deal with, right? Because it's much easier to change the way you are than to change people around you. Uh, I think the latter is much easier. And I think the most important skill that one would have is a listening skill, to be able to listen in a non judgmental way and not to rush into giving false reassurance. I think the one thing we shouldn't do when someone is having a difficult time is to say something like, hey, come on, pull out of it, tighten your belt. Other people. Sorry, I think I might have muted myself. The last thing you want is to sort of give people false reassurance. Never be judgmental. Never say things like, for example, hey, you know what, you're really responsible because you've been drinking so much. Just listen, and if you can't think of anything to say, don't say anything. Just listen, be there, be with the person where they are, meet them where they are. And usually your own humanity will really come to life and give you a sense of what it is that you can do. If that is a close friend, you can just put a hand on their shoulder to demonstrate that you're with them, you're listening to them, and you feel some of their suffering. That's the least you can do. There's a lot of other things you can do beyond that, but I won't go down that route right now. The first question you asked me is, what do you do when the person you are sharing your difficulties with looks at you in an unsympathetic way? That's much harder to shift, right? Because how can you change their mindset? Well, the first thing to say is, don't be disappointed, because the truth is, given the history of stigma attached to mental health, the low levels of understanding related to mental health we talked about a moment ago, it should be something that you might even expect, particularly from the older generation. And so if you find that you hit a wall, if you find that the person you're talking to doesn't show the empathy or compassion you were looking for or needed at that time, go and find someone else. But do not be dejected, do not despair. Just remember that that person is burdened by centuries of stigma that has been attached to mental health. Their hearts and minds will change one day, but maybe they haven't yet changed right now.
That makes a lot of sense. In the case that you are a young person, you're, 12-year-old, 14-year-old school child, so the only people you can turn to really are your parents or maybe some relatives, but you're scared of that. Are there resources you would recommend people can turn to if people in their own immediate situations and environments are not supported?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, it's certainly when you're at that age, Avanti, you can certainly turn to your peers. I believe that, our peers in the class we're in and in our colleges, I think that's very important. And increasingly so in many, well, certainly in colleges, such as, for example, in Harvard, there was a peer mental health support group. And so everyone knew that if they were having a difficult time, that there was somebody in the university, someone in school who actually you could reach out to as the first responder. Now, unfortunately, of course, that is not the rule. It's actually pretty much the exception. And I certainly would like to see a world in which every educational institution actually does have some kind of peer group that is then actively supported by the management in terms of skills and other kinds of enablement, so that this group can actually reach out and be reached out to for their peers who have mental health problems. The others are teachers. In many school environments, there are certain teachers who are well recognized or well known, might even have official roles in the school for providing mental health support. So there are these two sources of support within your immediate community. Neighbors is yet another kind of person we can turn to. Your primary care doctor, might be much more sympathetic than anyone else. And then finally, beyond that, in this digital world, there's a whole range of resources that we can access online. You know, Sangat's It's Okay to Talk program actually does have a number of different resources that you can access by visiting the website, a range of free and digital online resources for counselors, for information, just information. And so there's a ton of information out there that young people can access from the privacy of their own phones.
Now, that's super helpful. And for everybody watching, I will definitely list those resources. We have people sharing in the comments about their own situations, and some people are dealing with grief of the loss of a loved one, or dealing with, you know, somebody who's going through a physical or mental illness battle. And if you joined in right now, you can definitely go back and check where Dr. Patel talked about how you can be there for somebody, you know, who is dealing with certain situations. But I've been also noticing a lot of questions, particularly from students, about how do you deal with the following, and I'm just going to club them together: overthinking, stress, especially during exams, and emotion. I know that's a lot together, but however you'd like to address those,
Yeah.
because
So
they've been coming up quite.
yeah, so the first thing is not pathologize the way you feel. Okay, it's really important. Let me give you a metaphor. If you ran 10 kilometers and you weren't accustomed to running more than a kilometer, what would you expect your body to do? It would respond, right? It would respond. For example, you'd have a lot of muscle pain. Some of us might have some cramps, and you know that evening you might find difficult to actually sleep because your body was aching. Would we immediately think this is a disease? No, we wouldn't, right? Or we'd say, oh my God, I've had a really rough run today and my body is reacting. And I think you really got to think of your mind in very much the same way. Our mind is in a constant dance with the world around us. And if we're feeling very angry and we recognize, first of all, we got to recognize that this is not us. I'm feeling really angry right now. I'm feeling so angry that the next person says anything to me, I'm going to probably shout back at them. And I know that, hey, this isn't me and this is not the kind of person I want to be. What I need to step back and ask myself is what's happening that's making me feel angry? And I think almost always you will find something that is happening, that you've been disappointed by someone or something that's happened. So being able to normalize your mental health difficulties by being able to connect it with the world around us is the first thing we do. But obviously before that, Avanti, we have to acknowledge we're having a difficulty, right? So just being conscious and sensitive to your mental health. The example I gave of the wound on your leg is exactly right. And then not immediately jumping to the conclusion that there's something crazy about yourself, but instead searching for the cause or the meaning for the way you feel. A couple of other things that people have asked, I found some other things that I find very helpful, and I'll just share them with you. Being mindful, being able to enjoy the present. Many of our mental health difficulties or anxieties are because we're worried about what lies ahead. And right now, with the pandemic, the number of uncertainties has just multiplied manifold. So uncertainty is a hugely stressful experience on our minds, and it is the single biggest cause for mental health difficulty. So trying to focus your mind on today, on what's about to happen this evening, on being focused on the here and now, and meditation and mindful practices actually encourage you to do that by essentially focusing, for example, your mind on inner sensations like your breathing. That's why mindfulness is so effective. It's really focusing your mind on the present. Exercise, incredibly helpful. And the reason, of course, is because our physical well-being and our mental well-being are like this. They're not separate. Maybe medicine has separated them out, but the truth is our minds and our bodies are completely inseparable. And a couple of other things that I find very helpful: getting involved in something purposeful. You know, each and every one of us feels very strongly about some cause in the world around us. Being involved in something that is beyond our own personal interest, in some kind of community activity, something altruistic, even something as simple as knowing that, for example, in the building on the 6th floor, there is an older person who has not been able to leave the building because of the pandemic for the last 9 months. Basically calling them or reaching out to them, saying, do you need any help with the groceries? Can I spend some time talking to you on the phone, etc. Small little acts of compassion and gratitude actually benefit yourself more than anyone that you're actually reaching out to. Remember that compassion is one of the most powerful ways to promote your own mental health and well-being.
I love that. And, you know, those are really simple strategies to work on your mental health every day, and to build that resilience. And I think that's really, really important. A lot of people are asking questions around, you know, how do I differentiate between general teenage angst and depression or anxiety? Is there a cure for depression and anxiety if those exist? And so, I think if you could perhaps shed some light on some stressors that might exist in somebody's life, and whether people even need stressors who have, a poor experience with their mental health.
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, let me tell you honestly, there isn't a clear line in the sand that I can draw between the general teenage angst and depression, anxiety. One has to rely on those three different criteria I mentioned earlier, pervasiveness, duration, impact. But I want to really turn to the question about why are these teenage years, the years of being a young person, so incredibly important when it comes to the emergence of mental health problems. One fact that your listeners may be interested to know is that most mental health problems, roughly 75% of all mental health problems that you see in the population, have their origins before the age of 24. Let's pause and think about that. It means that most mental health problems start when you're young. So the question that really naturally arises is why? And now we have a very good understanding why. And I'm going to try and make that very simple. The first is radically new understandings of what is happening in our brains during these teenage years. We used to think that the brain was a very static organ after childhood. It just basically was downhill all the way. You just kept losing parts of your brain as you grew older. Now we know that actually young people, that phase of life is another developmentally incredibly critical period for brain development. And this is the phase in life when, for example, certain parts of the brain are maturing much earlier than other parts of the brain. And as a consequence, this is the phase in life when we are most likely to take risks and behave impulsively. Now, any young person will immediately say, that's exactly me. I have these impulsive reactions to what's happening around me. I tend to do things that my grown-up parents and my older adults would say, how could you do this? It was such a stupid, risky thing to do. Well, rest assured, you're not doing it because you're being mischievous or deliberately horrible. You're doing it because actually risk taking is almost wired in to your brains at this phase of life. And the second thing that interacts with this natural tendency to take risks and be impulsive is the fact that you're undergoing dramatic social transitions. Avanti, think about this. By the age of 12 or 13, until that age, you're totally dependent on your parents for everything. By the age of 21, you're totally independent. And many of us will have children who are dependent on us by the time we're in the early 20s. In the space of 8 or 9 years, you make a transition from being a completely dependent human being to being a completely independent human being. And you have to do that in 8 or 9 years. Complete your studies, find a partner, get a job, and settle down. There is no 8 or 9 year period in your entire life when so much is happening to you. And it is this incredible rapidity of transitions in your world with the incredible changes happening in your brain that actually make us understand why most mental health problems emerge during this period. This also means that difficulties with your mental health are remarkably common during growing up years, but it doesn't mean that that's a mental illness. It means what I said earlier, that as you face all these transitions, you're going to face a lot more challenges during this phase of your life than at any other phase. And on top of that, you're going to have to deal with that in a very, very impulsive and risk-taking way, because that's the way your brain is currently wired. And so it's that combination that will make you feel, people often say young people are volatile. They have these extremes of despair and joy and thrill and so on. Well, it's exactly because of the reasons I just mentioned. That is not mental illness. That is just being a young person and experiencing the sorts of emotional highs and lows that are characteristic of being a young person.
That makes sense. And a lot of people have been asking kind of how to deal with these emotional volatilities in that age group and also balance everything. And, if you're joining right now, Dr. Patel mentioned certain strategies such as exercising, finding purpose in life, meditation and mindfulness, and things of that nature. So definitely go watch that back. But to to build off of what you're saying, right? Is is there a understanding, right? There's this phase of life, and as you grow, you are experiencing different things. So, is there a different way of looking at how our mental health is impacted based on the stage of life we're at? For example, does are there any things, changes within our environment, or body that could affect us as we grow older or younger? Are there signs people are asking that we should be looking out for, say, in our parents or grandparents or within ourselves to know whether we are dealing with certain issues or not?
Yeah, so certainly I think yes, the experience of stressors do have different impacts according to how old you are. And I'd say, as I mentioned a little earlier, that childhood and adolescence are the two developmentally the most critical phases of our life course, when adversities in our environments have the greatest effect on our mental health. In fact, Avanti, your listeners will be interested to know that the most significant and replicated risk factor for poor mental health or good mental health in your adulthood is the experiences you had in your childhood. Actually, this is one of the oldest observations at the heart of psychiatry. Sigmund Freud wrote about this more than 100 years ago. His explanation was incorrect, but at that time, we didn't really have a good understanding of how the brain works. The observation is still true today. Childhood adversity is associated with poor mental health in adult life. We now have a much better understanding of the mechanism through which that happens. And therefore, we also have a better understanding of what needs to be done to try and reduce the negative impacts of adverse childhood experiences. Now, the question was a related question that was asked is, how do we know when we're having a mental health difficulty? I think I've already talked about that in terms of your own mental health difficulty. And I think the same would apply to people around you. If, for example, you see your parent who otherwise was very, sociable, would always be there at the dinner table every evening, would love to talk about what happened during the day, would ask you, hey, Avanti, how was your day? Tell me, oh, did you go and play football today? And tell me how did your team do, etc. And suddenly you notice that for the past many weeks, not just for yesterday, because even yesterday could just be a transient thing, but for the many weeks, your dad has suddenly changed, has become quiet, doesn't talk much, misses a few dinners. There's a tangible change in behavior or their interpersonal relationship. That might be a signal that that your dad might be having a mental health problem. That said, even if it happens on one day, I would encourage you to ask your dad, hey, Bob, what's wrong? Is something happened today? You're not your usual self today. And I think this is what we should do to each other. If you sense that somebody close to you, a friend, a parent, a relative, a neighbor, is behaving unusually, something that you know is out of keeping with their usual way, please reach out to them. It's exactly like what you do if, for example, someone you know well suddenly walks into your room and is limping, and they never limped before. Wouldn't you immediately say, hey, Avanti, why are you limping? Did something happen? Please do that. Please do that with anyone that you see that you feel that their mental health is in the way that it used to be.
I think that's a great tip. And I know we only have a few minutes left. There's many questions coming in, so I'll just stick to the last 5 questions or so. One person, Ishika, is asking. Let me just go back. How do you know? This is more of a question to you in terms of being a psychiatrist. How do you know psychiatry is a subject for you and that you can handle the pressure that comes along with it? She'd asked a question earlier. What if your own mental health is turbulent? How do you as a professional deal with that? And is how do basically anybody who's thinking of going into mental health professionally, how do you think, what are the things associated with, and how do you think they can handle it themselves?
Well, I'll tell you what, I found a lot of, I rely a lot on my own understanding of psychological science and the work that I do with Sangat, which is the design of psychological interventions for people with mental health problems. I have learned so much in actually doing that that I use in my everyday life. As just one example, one of the most effective techniques that we use for people who are depressed is called behavioral activation, which simply means getting you to identify rewarding and pleasurable activities that you stop doing and that you have actually withdrawn from because of stress, and that is making you feel depressed. And you start doing that. In my case, that's swimming. Swimming is an exercise for me, but it's also a very rewarding and pleasurable activity. The whole act of going to a pool, getting in the water, and spending half an hour swimming. So even if I'm feeling really lousy, I will never ever give up my swimming. The other example that I've discovered in the last year, thanks to the lockdown, is walking my dog. I enjoy walking my dog, and I think that that's another way that it gives me half an hour of getting out of the house, walking in my neighborhood in the village I live in, and of course my dog who I love greatly. So I apply the same principles of psychological science that I use in designing my interventions for helping people in primary health centers and communities. I apply the same thing in my everyday life. But I will say one more thing that I've done, which I think is very personal and private. But since I've been asked, and the spirit of disclosure, I have been through periods of being very, very low. I have a very strong family history of depression. My mom had depression for much of her adult life. And so I'm very sensitive of the fact that there is a strong current of low mood that runs in my family, and there was a period of some quite a few years ago when I was having some setbacks in my career, and I remember beginning to experience very distressing emotions. For example, losing interest in things that I know I used to enjoy doing, and I immediately sort of cottoned on that there was something wrong here, and I needed to do something about it. And what I did then was I spoke to my mentor, a more senior psychiatrist who I greatly respected, and I reached out to him, and he basically acted more as a friend and as a mentor rather than as a psychiatrist, and just gave me advice, and actually did probably little more than listen, and be non-judgmental in exactly the same kind of way that I think we should be with other people around us when we see that they're distressed.
Thank you, Sophie, for being comfortable and sharing your self-disclosure. I think it will help a lot of people who are in similar boats. There's a lot of questions coming in about areas that are associated with mental health, but might be even more stigmatized. And I would just love your quick thoughts on these three areas: addiction, trauma, and suicide.
Yeah, well, addiction is the most stigmatized, but even more than addiction, I think it's serious mental illness. Let's be honest, walk around a big city anywhere in the world, including here in India, you will see people who are clearly homeless, but also clearly not well. How often do we simply walk past them and look the other way? And I think it's not just the homelessness that we're looking the other way from, but we're also looking away from their mental health problems. Many of these individuals will also have substance use problems with either, opiates or alcohol. And again, I think alcohol and opiates are heavily stigmatized. The very nature of stigma is seen in the laws in this country. For example, the imposition of prohibition is a signal that this is a moral defect, right? What do you prohibit? You prohibit crimes. But the very act of prohibiting the use of alcohol suggests that if you're a drinker, you're a criminal. Therefore, this is another example of a very conservative and I'd say actually very primitive attitude towards substance use, which prevails in India and in many other parts of the world. So I think addictions are heavily stigmatized, and we need to fight that. We need to make it clear that when you're addicted to any substance, this is a health problem, and we need to treat it as a health problem and a mental health problem more particularly. Now, the other stigma is suicide. It was stigmatized partly by the law. The fact that it was criminalized for so long and only got decriminalized a few years ago. I think the stigma against suicide is reducing a lot now because of that. And I think people are much more open to talk about their self-harm attempts. And one thing I will say, Avanti, that I would strongly encourage young people to do is to engage with the idea of disclosure and storytelling. And I think earlier you mentioned the It's Okay to Talk initiative of Sangat, and that's exactly what one of the goals of the initiative is to encourage people to share stories without shame, without fear, because we believe that in telling your stories that may include stories of substance use or self-harm, you're doing a very powerful act to try and reduce stigma attached to these behaviors.
Thank you for shedding light on that, especially, for those of you who are joining in, We talked a little bit about stigma and the history of it, and I really enjoyed hearing your perspective, Dr. Patel, on that because, from somebody who has been so deep in the field and studied it for so long, I feel like you have such an incredible perspective on it. I will just close out with a couple last questions that we have. I know many of you have many more questions, but we will try our best to figure out ways to address them. And do check out It's Okay to Talk, which is an initiative by Sangat, and you can share your own stories. There's also incredible resources on their website if you are looking for assistance and help. And I will make sure I link everything below. We have a question that is asking about, or multiple questions rather, that are asking about the symptoms that are physical but are stemming from mental health issues. Let me clarify, people have read clearly on the internet or elsewhere that perhaps loss of voice, loss of appetite, not getting your period on time, extreme stress, not being able to think clearly. So are these connected? How is our physical health connected to our mental health, and what should we be looking out for?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the biggest mistakes that was done in medicine was to pretend that the mind was separate from the body. And in part because there were different theories about why one had mental health problems, and they were seen related to one's, spiritual and supernatural factors, whereas the body was physical. And we know today that that was a fundamental error, and that actually the mind and the body are inseparable, literally inseparable. So the brain, which is where in many ways our mind actually has its biological base, is deeply interconnected with one's physiology. And so it is very, very, it's almost normal to think of how one's physical well-being is going to be affected by one's mental health. One example of that is simply this: when one is anxious, a particular part of the brain called the autonomic nervous system gets excited, it gets aroused. What that part of the nervous system is controlling is things like our heart rate, our gut motility, our breathing. And so you will quickly see what happens to us when we're very tense. What happens? Typically, the most common experience is you feel in your heart, you feel your heart beating fast. You can feel a little bit of shakiness. You might even feel yourself getting a little breathless. This is actually a mental state of anxiety driving your physical well-being in a particular way. And because very often you don't realize that your heart is beating fast because you're anxious, it makes you nervous that you might be getting some kind of physical problem, which in turn then precipitates an acute anxiety attack. So it's a vicious cycle then. But I just want to reassure your listeners that almost every single kind of mental health problem is associated with physical features and symptoms. And it is completely normal for that to happen because the mind affects the body whenever the mind is affected adversely.
Thank you. Thank you so much for shedding light on that. And the last question before I let you go is twofold. We've talked about the role of educational institutions earlier. And a lot of people, as I mentioned on here, are students. So many of them are asking if they want to create initiatives in their schools about mental health awareness, what would that look like? So that's one. And then the other, I think, entity that can also make a huge change is, of course, governments across the world. So what policies do you think governments can put into place to increase access to care?
So for the first question, demand from the school management, from the PTA, from whoever is in charge, that you want to have a lot more on the subject of mental health in the school. Conversations, peer group discussions, workshops, art competitions, whatever is happening in the school, but with the theme of mental health. And if you can get past that first step, demand the setting up of a mental health counseling cell, which could be initially serviced by a teacher or a counselor who's employed by the school, but could also include peer groups. That is to say, older kids in the school who have undergone some amount of skills training and are being supported to provide first responder mental health care. In response to the second question about policymakers, clearly we need a lot more money. There's no question about that. Mental health interventions are extremely underfunded. But I think it's also very important for me to emphasize that money needs to be spent wisely. It must be guided by the best science and with a very strong grounding in justice and human rights. And by that, I mean, we need to be investing that money at the base of the pyramid, not just at the top of the pyramid of doctors and psychiatric hospitals, but actually in building the community-facing providers, the community health workers, the teachers, the community counselors, etc., who we have shown time and again with adequate training and support can deliver mental health care very effectively in any context in this country or around the world.
Yeah. Wow, well, this was an incredibly informative session. Thank you so much, Dr. Patel, for taking out the time out of your very busy schedule. I have certainly had a wonderful time, and I know people have been enjoying it too. You can go check out the comments in the chat after this and see how many people are truly grateful to you for answering their questions and for providing information on this. And again, if any of y'all have any other questions, you can feel free to send them to me through any of the social platforms, and we'll figure out ways to at least share resources. But the one resource you should definitely check out right now is It's Okay to Talk. It is itsokaytotalk.in, It's Okay Baat Karo, and it is an initiative by Sangat, Dr. Patel's organization. You can share your own story, find resources there. And thank you all so much for tuning in. We will save this live stream so you can go watch it, share it, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you, Avanti. Bye-bye.
Okay, pretty sure that